Well, greeting Denzians of the internet. Now, some of you have caught my video on my reaction to the Black Ops 2 trailer, and I feel I should explain a little bit my negative opinion of that. And it has to do with what I would think is the degeneration of the Call of Duty series, specifically in its single-player aspect. Now, I am a big single-player gamer. It's not that I don't play multiplayer games. I do. I pull out Killing Floor or Left 4 Dead, and I'm recently tried out Orion Dino Beatdown, an indie game that's multiplayer centric. But my heart goes always to the single player game. I'm the guy that took video game narrative studies in college. I like the way that an interactive story is told, which video gaming to me is. This is why I like RPGs and other things. And there's a lot of people that agree with me. Let's face it, single-player games overall outsell multiplayer games. Granted, it's hard to tell the difference sometimes because a lot of games try to do both. They do the single-player and they do the multiplayer. So it's hard to tell. And even Call of Duty knows to push this, which is why they always release their single-player trailers first, and then go on with the multiplayer stuff later on when it's closer to release. And there's a lot of reasons behind that. But I want to talk about, today, my problems with the plot of Call of Duty. And to understand that, you have to understand where I'm coming from, and that is the origins of the series, which don't even lie in the first Call of Duty game, but even before the first Call of Duty game. The thing that led to Call of Duty being developed in the first place. And for that, we have to go all the way back to 1998 and Steven Spielberg. See, after the release of Saving Private Ryan, Spielberg was on a big World War II kick, and at the time, his studio, DreamWorks, also had a gaming division. So, Spielberg decided to press heavy for the development of a World War II game that would basically break new grounds in terms of artificial intelligence, 3D interactivity, and cinematic presentation. That game, of course, being Medal of Honor. Now, really, this is the genesis of Call of Duty, even though it was from a rival franchise. The AI was amazing. Believe me, for the time, the fact that you would throw a grenade and the German soldiers would either jump on it or kick it back blew your mind. In addition to that, the fact that you had some missions where you would actually go undercover and have to interact and be all nervous added a real cinematic flair to everything. And not to mention just the general presentation, the soundtrack, and everything else. It was a monster hit for the time, and led to a lot of imitators. It spawned what we would later call the World War II shooter. Everyone and their mother tried to cash in on this. The Call of Duty franchise itself continued with more sequels that followed the same formula, and other movies or other gaming studios tried to cash in on the genre as well. However, there was one thing that how should I put it, seemed the same. They were too cinematic. They seemed to never put you in the actual battles. You always played a spy working behind the lines, infiltrating a Nazi base somewhere, instead of actually fighting on D-Day. Hence Call of Duty, which decided to take a different approach to World War II. You see, unlike the cinematic games that filled up the genre, Call of Duty wanted to actually put you in the battlefield as one of the soldiers. And so what did they do to that? They got better AI that would work with you, so all of a sudden you had squads, something which the other games couldn't, because the technology hadn't advanced enough. Putting AI that worked with you always resulted in a disaster with these games. But Activision, for their sake, actually developed the technology, or maybe not Activision, but whoever they had developing it, actually got the AI to work with you. They figured out how to do it. Sometimes it meant giving your AI buddies unlimited health at times. Sometimes it meant hiding spawn points so the AI can die, but every time they died, a new bot would spawn and replace that one. And so they really worked out how to actually put you in a battle with fellow teammates, and therefore you could actually be put on D-Day, in Market Garden, on the beaches of North Africa, or the sands of North Africa, I should say. And not only that, they did other things that emphasize it. They took the storytelling elements, again, of Spielberg, and took them and made basically what he had done in Saving Private Ryan kind of work, trying to build up teams, trying to build up a character of what these guys went through during the war. And little things they did as well. They put even the generic guys that you were fighting all got individual names. You went over the crosshairs, you got the name. They also did, when they did the cutscenes, they tried to present it like a historical documentary. They would tell of, they'd bring in veterans, and the veterans would really talk about their service. And really, that's where the name comes from, Call of Duty, how they felt the call of duty to serve in World War II. They also did something else that broke genre norms. They decided, hey, Americans don't have to just play as Americans. We can have them play as British soldiers. We can even tap into the Russian campaign and have them play as Russian soldiers. Something that a lot of people thought unthinkable. It's hard to actually imagine, but up until the late 1990s, people in the United States really didn't talk about the Soviet campaign in World War II. This is a vestige, of course, of the Cold War, where the Soviets were the bad guys, so we didn't like to really talk about how it was really the Soviets that crushed the Nazi Empire. Oh, we helped out, no doubt, but the Soviets did the brunt of the fighting, and had the biggest battles. And, of course, the biggest battle of them all, Stalingrad, which even most Americans were forced to actually admit was the biggest battle of the war. Well, Call of Duty decided to actually tap into that and put you in the position of a Soviet soldier fighting in Stalingrad. Of course, they stole from cinema. Maybe not steal, but they did things like in Call of Duty 2, recreated scenes from Enemy at the Gates, which was about, of course, snipers in Stalingrad. And lo and behold, this was a huge success. People loved the idea that they were actually fighting in the actual battles, and they added a great multiplayer to it, which was also a hell of a lot of fun. And even I'll have to admit, multiplayer is one of the things that really helped sell the Call of Duty franchise. But I digress. Regardless, the franchise continued on for Call of Duty 1, 2 on the Xbox 360, 3 on the 360, and it was doing pretty well. However, the World War II genre was only getting even more and more overstuffed. There is more. Call of Duty itself was successful and eventually started to surpass the Medal of Honor franchise, which began to become stale, overused, and wind up collapsing. Eventually, the franchise of Medal of Honor was even forced to try to copy Call of Duty by trying to put you more into battles, even though they still try to keep up the commando aspect of it. And the developers of Call of Duty felt this as well. They really felt that World War II shooters were developing a kind of a bubble, and that they were going to have to address this bubble if they wanted to survive as a franchise. So what did they decide to do? Let's take the Call of Duty franchise and set it in modern times. Hence comes Call of Duty 4 Modern Warfare. Now, Call of Duty 4 is an excellent game, and it broke a lot of grounds. They really freed up everything about redefining this game while still keeping things in the same vein as the rest of the Call of Duty franchise. You see, if you really look at Call of Duty 4, it really lives up to what they were trying to do with the Call of Duty franchise up to then. Be respectful of how wars are fought and what it's like to be in them. And Call of Duty 4 fits this perfectly. One, they continue to divide the campaign up between multiple points of view. So we get British SAS soldiers, American Marines. Great. It also really encompasses what modern warfare is like today. You have your kind of more traditional stand-up operations, like we had in the desert levels when you're fighting the Middle Eastern militaries, but those were pretty one-sided. We got that whole sense, and it did try to at least get that sense that we're going in to kick ass and take names, and this is what the public really likes to see. We really see, I guess, is what they were trying to imply. But it also showed, hey, this is also the nuclear age. It showed the consequences of if you were to fight wars like this, and somebody has a nuclear weapon, well, your character dies. Because, hey, nukes don't discriminate, and radiation poison can kill you quite easily. And that was really a big game changer. Granted, it wasn't the first game to do that, but it was the first game that had wide market audience that did that. The fact that you could play a character and no matter what you did, your character would die. And they did that for a couple scenes. The opening scene where you basically had very limited control over a presidential candidate that was taken hostage and then executed in a very cinematic manner. And then, of course, later on when your Marine character winds up exploding, crashing in a helicopter, and then crawling out only to die of radiation poisoning, and not to die in a cutscene, but to die while they're still under your control. Big cinematic moment, really had put emphasis to the gamer and put them in their shoes. Later, the franchise would abuse the hell out of this, to the point where it became an annoying trope. But for that first game, that was big. It really took the audience, or the gamers, by surprise. And they also showed the other aspects of modern warfare, the stuff that's going on behind the scenes that you don't really hear about, or you only hear about way after, mostly through the SAS guys, where you're fighting Russians, but you're not even fighting Russians and Russians. You're fighting in a group, a paramilitary party in Azerbaijan because they can't stay in Russia, doing things that nobody really cares about, and not really the public not getting how they're connected with the events taking place in the Middle East. It really, when you look at it, is a very complex situation where the real villains or the real bad guys aren't necessarily the ones that you're seeing on the news. And by the end, they also still got the whole sense of, hey, this is a Call of Duty game, and the last couple of missions are made up of Russian Special Forces, American Special Forces, and British Special Forces teaming up to go on a mission to take out these Russian ultranationalists which are trying to seize control of nuclear weapons. And it worked. It worked as basically what we're trying to show. How modern warfare is fought. It's fought, by Marines and other units fighting very outmatched enemies, but also by Special Forces guys going deep behind enemy lines without much support. And it worked. It brought in more cinematic elements, no doubt, but it still felt like Call of Duty. Then came World at War, which took those elements and emphasized them even more, shall I say. Yeah, it went back to World War II. It tried to at least do the Pacific, I'll give it that. Something that's still not tapped in that much. I don't know why. The Pacific theater was just as violent. There's probably not as many movies based on it, which is a big thing, because Call of Duty likes to copy movies, like Red Dawn, which we'll talk about in a sec. But it, again, tried to go for the cinematic moments, and you really could tell it was trying to recreate the same moments from Call of Duty 4. And that's where the thing kind of felt stale, shall we say. And it felt like they were trying too hard. But regardless, Modern Warfare 4 was such a success, they decided to split the franchise off and create Modern Warfare. It's its own sub-franchise. So they had Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2, which of course makes the whole numbering system very confusing. But regardless, this is where my problems come with the plot. As I said, Modern Warfare 4 makes a lot of sense. You have some sort of regime, military coup take place in a Middle Eastern country. The Marines decide to intervene. We've seen this happen before. We just had this happen relatively recently in Libya. Granted, we didn't have ground troops, but we were of course heavily involved. You had Iraq, Afghanistan. This stuff happens in real life. And of course, there isn't much of a fight. I mean, there's an intense, of course, battle, but you really got the sense that these Middle Eastern military wasn't that big of a huge threat to the United States. It was an intense fight, yes, but yeah, we were going to win that one. And then you had, of course, Special Forces guys having to operate in Azerbaijan fighting ultranationalists. And though we don't know about that type of stuff happening, that was kind of the point, is that we're fighting people you have no idea about. Remember, at the end of Call of Duty 4, they don't even mention, they kind of make it clear that the public was completely unaware of what was going on in Russia, and still wasn't aware. There's a reference in there about how the newspapers couldn't get a reaction from the ultranationalist party in Russia over the events that were happening in elsewhere, indicating that they had kind of been taken out, and we had no idea why, or the press had no idea why, or what was involved and what happened. Call of Duty 2, though, took things to a little bit more extreme and started making less sense plot-wise. Remember, everything in Call of Duty 4 made sense. It seemed realistic. But then they try to make it that the Russians have been now taken over by the ultranationalist party. Which first off seemed a little off, because the ultranationalists in the first one, you really got the sense that they were an extreme group that had already been kicked out of Russia proper. Most of the game took place in Azerbaijan as their base of operations, and they were kind of on the ropes, where Russian special forces were kind of hunting them down, shooting them. You never got the sense that these guys were taken anywhere near close to being a legitimate group. And yet somehow, after they've already been defeated, they win. Which, okay, granted, that can occasionally happen, but you need some sort of explanation. And then you have a group that broke off of this group that became Makarov. I can't believe I mispronounced that. You got the sense, they say he then further broke off and became even more of an extremist. First off, why do you even need that? Why not just say that I cannot speak today. Makarov took over what remained of the ultranationalists. There's really no reason to say otherwise. You don't have to say this. The Russians have now been run by the ultranationalist party. You really don't. You're going to say that Makarov took over what remained of the ultranationalist extremist group, and that his group is still running around. What was left. You really didn't need to do that. Make it so. But then they want to further set up with a war between Russia and the United States, which, I mean, as much as we like to put the U.S. versus Russia, Russia is still not to where it was in the 80s when it was the Soviet Union. It's militarily, it's developed some nice things, but even its nice new equipment, it can only afford in extremely small numbers. Yes, it developed a new stealth fighter, the PAC-50, but they can't produce those in huge quantities like the United States can produce F-22s. Oh, granted, even F-22, they've only produced like 120 of them, but that kind of has to do with the fact that they decided to go with F-35s as the next phase. But my point still stands. Russia does produce some very fine weapons now, but it's still in small quantities. Most of Russia still relies on older Soviet equipment that they have in vast quantities. Russia really isn't the big threat that we like to think of it as, especially in what we would call power projection. It can be a beast if you fight it on its own territory or directly adjacent to its own territory. But its recent war with Georgia, even though it won, kind of shows that it's not the best power in the world. It's got issues, which is why most of the times when you're fighting Russia, they like to put it in the future to give it time to fully redevelop, like Fuels of War did. They decided to have it placed in the future where you can kind of see Russia has now 20 years to really clean up its act. If we're talking directly modern Russia, it shouldn't be able to invade the U.S. Like they do there, which I'll get into more. I know I have a lot of Russian viewers, so I don't want to put off you guys too. I don't want to put off you guys too much. It's just a practicality thing of like what Russia has in its arsenal right now, what can it really afford, and this more has to do with Call of Duty 3. But I need to explain some things with Call of Duty 2. The things that happen in Call of Duty 2 really push everything to the extreme of acceptability. It just barely makes it in there. But I first have to go with the whole incident. Basically, Makarov sets up a terrorist attack, of which everyone can clearly see that he's involved, a Russian. There's surveillance cameras still taking a picture. He's known, but they decide to blame the United States because one individual was found to be a soldier. First off, if he's with the CIA and they deleted all his fingerprints and everything else, how did they even know? Now, granted that he was a U.S. soldier. Now, granted, yes, it's revealed that that General Shepard is trying to manipulate this whole situation. I still don't see how he was able to pull this off. Okay, maybe he could leak that one guy there was a former U.S. soldier. That does not justify invasion. Even with us. Because there's way too many questions you'd have to ask. Like, okay, is this one U.S. soldier? One guy that was maybe used to be a U.S. soldier was involved with this attack. Most people would go, well, maybe he went off and he's an extremist? He doesn't represent an actual U.S. threat? Again, you could clearly see that Makarov was part of the attack. He should be known to be a Russian. And yet the Russians kind of fall for this hook, line, and sinker that, yes, because we found one body that was linked to having served with the U.S. military, we should invade the U.S. And the rest of the world completely agrees with them. The stupidity there, it's just amazing. Now, granted, maybe that's why they felt they had to make them ultranationalists, so that the Russians, they could blame that it was a party that was predisposed to wanting to go to war with the U.S. Okay, maybe, possibly, we could buy that. But the whole invasion of the United States at that point, this is what I kind of got the impression of for Modern Warfare 2. That this was a desperate act by the Russians, who I guess were pressured, by public pressure, to go to war with the U.S. And so what they did is they try to land their planes, they try to do a paratrooper attack to seize and hold the greater Washington metropolitan area in order to sue for peace rather quickly. That's something I can kind of get behind. You get a couple of divisions, you use your kind of one-shot trick to get through U.S. defenses, the fact that you recovered a satellite and kind of disguise your incoming fleet of paratroopers, or planes, and you land your troops, you quickly land, try to secure D.C., and then quickly sue for peace, hoping before the U.S. can rally its army, pull them back from overseas, get the rest of their troops stationed in the United States from counterattacking. You can kind of see it's a very risky move, but it might pay off. You're betting that the U.S. will kind of freak out, and they know they can't launch the nukes because you didn't do a nuke, and it's still too much of a recoverable area, that you'll negotiate, and you'll negotiate from a point of power where maybe you'll withdraw your troops and you'll get something, a base or two overseas, payments or something, an admission of guilt, something like that, to quickly make the war over and that you're the winner. That's within the realm of possibility for the Soviets, well, not the Soviets, but the Russians to pull off. Even modern Russia, if that was what they were trying to do in Modern Warfare 2, if they made that more clear that that's what the Russians were actually doing, that they knew they couldn't win a war with the United States, their idea was to go for the jugular, force a quick surrender, hoping that the Americans would rather not have their main capital city destroyed in a massive battle, and go home, claim victory, hoorah. I could kind of buy that. It's within the realm of possibility, but it pushes it to the extreme. For one thing, once later on you have in the game, when it's not a quick victory, the Russians are still fighting a tough fight in the middle of DC, which you gotta imagine these guys are being cut off from resupply. I mean, they shouldn't be able to fight for that long against a concentrated U.S. counterattack. To the point where the only thing that makes them kind of surrender is an EMP blast. And you also have to wonder, yes, it made it clear that the U.S. was somewhat isolated thanks to the events in Russia. But if the rest of the world they would immediately, even if Europe thought, hey, U.S. is doing some fishy stuff, I gotta imagine the rest of the world would rather quickly go, whoa, invading the United States is kind of a disproportionate reaction. But alas, this brings us into 3. Because in Modern Warfare 2, we immediately see the Russian attack in the United States collapse. And Russian paratrooper divisions tend to be the best that they have. And we can only assume that the ones that attacked DC have now been completely wiped out, captured or surrendered, or captured or killed. And yet we start the game off with us having to fight off a massive Russian fleet, which for some reason decided to park itself in the middle of the harbor, so that anybody with a single piece of artillery on the mainland can just fire and hit the ships. Seriously, what the hell? No fleet pulls itself into a harbor like that while it's under attack. For the very reason why you saw huge wreckets of Russian ships all over the place. And you're forced to fight this battle. Okay, maybe you can buy that in addition to the attack, the paratrooper attack, they decide to also land an amphibious force and try to capture New York. Go for the twin jugulars of both DC and New York and sue for peace ideal. Again, this fails, and in that first mission, you wipe out the entire Russian fleet. The Russians don't have this massive navy, really. Even today. They got a decent-sized navy, yes. Pretty good. I would still put it in the top 10, no doubt. But you wipe out what would be most of it. Their like remaining carrier, you wipe out. You see a lot of the big ships in that harbor are destroyed. That's a pretty big, damn significant loss that you've basically wiped out the Russian Navy. Mainly because they decided to put themselves in the middle of New York Harbor while they're still fighting over it. I don't know why they did that. But they can't recover. Navies are really hard to rebuild once they're destroyed. It takes like decades to rebuild a navy. Not only that, you again lose whatever troops you were able to put into New York. The Navy's been wiped out. All the troops that you used to try to take over New York have been wiped out. And all the troops you used to attack DC have been wiped out. That is a massive, massive loss. You've just lost the core of the Russian army right there. And this is what gets me. Then later in the game, the Russians decide to attack all of Europe and overrun huge sections of Europe. Right after taking those 2 massive losses, the Russians in no way should be able to do that. If the United States lost that many troops, I don't think we would have the ability to invade Europe right after. That's a total war footing there. We would have to be at total war footing because they must have lost at least 50,000. And not just like killed. We're still talking like captured too. Because once you're cut off, most soldiers are going to be like, it's over. We'll surrender. The Americans probably aren't going to massacre us. Prisoner of war camp it is. Russia should not be able to invade after that. It's too big of a loss, or at least too big of a loss. They really should have done Modern Warfare 3 as a U.S. counterattack, have the fighting more in Europe, but in Russia itself, that would make more sense. They kind of even hinted at that. Most people were expecting that. U.S. troops land then in Russia as a counterattack. It's a valid thing. It would give, and here's even the bigger thing. Then you have Makarov kidnapping the Russian president in the most ridiculous manner possible, where not only he has a bunch of guys shooting up the entire plane, which happens to have it crash, and apparently they bet that the president would be in the exact spot on the plane, which they couldn't control how it would how it would crash if it did. It could have shot the pilot. The pilot could have slammed the thing in head front and killed everybody. Because, mind you, the entire purpose of this attack, apparently, was to gain control of the president so you could gain his nuclear launch codes. or so Makarov could get his nuclear launch codes. What the hell then would you plan an attack like that? Where you're shooting up, you could easily kill the president by just shooting him, the way they set it up, and then you crash the plane. Which you as a Secret Service agent and the president of Russia barely survive. Stupid plan. If he had been anywhere else in that plane, he would have been dead, and then you wouldn't have got your nuclear launch codes. But they don't explain, after they capture him, how Makarov apparently is now in full control of the Russian military. They needed to link another villain, i.e. some sort of Russian general that was sympathetic to Makarov and was really a Makarov supporter. They needed an actual person like that, a shepherd for Makarov, to kind of explain why he is able to now seemingly control all of Russia. How the Russian military seems to be responsive to him. And here's how this would have worked. I could have bought this more if, again, this was a counterattack in Russia. And you would have had Makarov as already an existing third-party faction within Russia, probably in control of some spots in Russia, and the Russians would not have cared as much to attack him when they're being attacked by, the Allies invading. I would have bought that a lot more easily. In fact, I think that's what the problem. I think a lot of the script was written with you counterattacking and fighting through Russia, and instead they decided to recreate World War II by having the Russians invade Paris and Berlin and other parts of Germany and the Czech Republic. Which that reminds me of another problem with this game. They end it then finally with, well, first off, the Russians using gas, attacking all those cities, causing massive casualties with gas. I'm pretty sure at that point, France and England would go, well, fuck you, Russia, here's a nuke. A lot of people don't even realize, especially when it comes to I'm pretty sure if you attacked Paris, the French response to that would be a nuclear weapon. Oh, you gassed France? Well, we're going to nuke Russia. It doesn't make a lot of sense. I mean, it may have been one thing if it was just the ultranationalist terrorist group doing it, where you don't have somebody you can strike, but it's made clear that this is a Russian stand-up military. Why is Russia not nuked at this point? They're using weapons of mass destruction. Why aren't, at the very least, the Allies counterattacking with bioweapons? Why aren't the Germans using whatever bioweapons they might have saved up? Or especially the French. The French were always, especially during the Cold War, would have probably been the first people to use a nuclear bomb. They had already drawn up a line on the map where if the Russians passed the Rhine, France was using nukes, regardless of what the U.S. wanted or whatever else. The French were going to nuke them on their own initiative. And yet, well, lo and behold, they don't do that even after being gas attacked and having their major city destroyed. And then we get to see the Czech Republic and the Russians are basically doing the Nazis. They literally did not treat the Russians as their own unique how Russia would do things. All right, maybe they would line people up and shoot them if it was a full, we're talking full total war situation here. I don't know, but you got the sense they were really just wrote in Nazis and this had them be Russians. But this makes even less sense than when the ending becomes so much more unsatisfactory, though, when you rescue the Russian president and it's just like, oh, let's just have peace, let's not fight. No, at this point, Russia's done a lot of bad things. They wouldn't. No, you're not in a situation at this point where it would be very easy to call off the attacks and end the war. The rest of the Europeans are going to want some sort of vengeance. We see the Czechs being like massacred in the streets. Paris, civilians have been gassed. At this point, they're going to. these other countries are going to go, no, occupation of Russia. Need it. Definitely. I just can't buy that the rest of the world's just going to be like, okay, well, we'll let you guys go with no problems. War crime trials? What are those? There was no crimes committed. You just gassed civilians and shot them in the streets. No hard feelings, Russia. Bullshit. Again, if they at least showed that there was battles in Russia, we would have been able to go, okay, parts of Russia have been occupied. Certainly they're going to sort through all that there. No, we got the impression they literally just packed up their troops and left. So the same troops that had been shooting civilians in Europe were let go scot-free. The commanders that commanded them just went back. Who knows? Maybe if they do a Modern Warfare 4, which is confusing because they already have Modern Warfare, Call of Duty Modern Warfare 4, and now Call of Duty. That is going to be confusing as hell. I just realized that. You have Call of Duty Modern Warfare 4. Wait, jeez. That is going to be so confusing when they do. No, because they did Call of Duty 4 Modern Warfare. Now they're going to have Call of Duty Modern Warfare 4. If they make, and you know they are, that is going to be so confusing. I just realized that. They're going to have to think of something with that. That's just going to drive people crazy. You already have that game, son. You don't need to buy it again. No, it's a different game. Because the 4 is in a slightly different place. We'll see that in a year or two. But I digress. Anyway, we see all that, and it just doesn't make any sense. The surrender, the peachy ending, it just annoys me, and it doesn't make any sense. And again, you've gotten away at this point. From what I started was the origin of the entire Call of Duty thing. Respectful for the troops that fight wars, and give us a real sense of how wars are fought. Modern Warfare 3 is probably the furthest thing from how real wars are fought. Not respectful for the troops that fight them. It's way too much more trying to be cinematic. It has become basically what Medal of Honor was. It has come full circle to where you have an unrealistic Hollywood-esque game. So that's why I brought up originally the whole Medal of Honor thing, because I went to Call of Duty and I became a big supporter of the Call of Duty franchise because it was going away from what they did in Medal of Honor, and now they've gone back to it. And it's not just in the Modern Warfare sub-franchise. They've done the same thing in their World War II game, World at War, which I haven't followed up on the World War II stuff, but I like to call this franchise A of the Call of Duty games, because World at War had a sequel, Black Ops, which did the same thing but during the Cold War. And okay, Black Ops I can at least a little bit more buy with that as a sub-franchise, because you want to do the Cold War. The Cold War, again, was one of those things that a lot of it was fought in shadows. You had proxy wars and such, so having Black Ops guys go do stuff was kind of fun. And as a sub-franchise, if they were to really do it legitimately, is fine. I liked how they did Black Ops. The story was very Cold War-y, but I also had problems with Black Ops. One, that they didn't. The weapon selection in Black Ops was horrible for it being a game set in that time period. You know, the really high-tech stuff should have been the AKs and the M16s. They had guns in there that weren't even developed at the time. You really should have had a mix of your basic assault weapons, the FLNs, the M16s, the AK-47s, RPKs, and still had stuff like Thompson submachine guns, MP40s, M1 Grands. These were all weapons that were still used. People were still using rifles in the 60s and the 70s. Those were still frontline weapons, especially in Vietnam. A lot of soldiers, a lot of the VC were still using French rifles. It wasn't until much later in the conflict that the AK-47s became that ambiguous. What else? So there was that, and this is kind of a minor thing, but it's because one of the things I love to study is military uniforms and the gear and stuff people would wear in combat. So it seemed like a lot of the troops were wearing too much body armor type stuff. I think it's because the developers, the game, like that kind of look, but it doesn't fit with how troops looked in the 60s and 70s. But I digress. But the point is, they still did a lot of the same things with the Black Ops franchise, and now they're setting it in the future. Which, okay, first things first. One, I know I made a comment in the Black Ops trailer reaction about how I wanted to see stuff, want to take it to the 80s and do Cold War stuff in the 80s. Apparently, a third of the game is taking place in the 80s. Good. What they should have done is done the entire game in the 80s. And I would have been happy. Would have been really happy with that. If they showed stuff in the 80s, showed stuff in Afghanistan going on, throw in maybe some stuff in Angola, which, of course, nobody knows what happened in Angola here, probably listening. It was a major Cold War battleground in the 80s. Or am I thinking Nambia? No, Angola. Actually, both. I would have been happy. I would have been really fine. I would have had no problems at all. I would have been, this looks interesting. But no, they're going to have robotic armies fighting in the future. Somehow Woods is still alive. But I've already done all this. But I think I've laid out my point of why I have a problem with it. Why this, to me, the franchise has degenerated. And again, people are going to bring up the multiplayer. And one, I think I have a very legitimate gripe that multiplayer has remained stale, that it hasn't really evolved at all in many of the games. I think the last thing that they added that was different was zombies, and let's face it, there's a ton of zombie shooters out there. You can play Killing Floor, you can play Left 4 Dead, which is a zombie game, are much better. Hell, there's even the Operation Raccoon City. There's zombie shooters out there. So it's hard to argue you should get this game because it has a zombie mode, when there's zombie dedicated games out there. Plus, almost any game now gets a zombie mode for it. And besides, like I said, I'm a single player gamer, and there's still no reason, as much as you want to complain about multiplayer, for a single player gamer justify this degeneration of the single player franchise. And the sad thing, of course, is I'll still wind up getting Black Ops 2. Because it does entertain me. But alas, I think I have gone on long enough. I think you've got the sense now why I have a problem. And not a problem. Like I said, I'll still buy it. But I got a little off topic there, but I'll still buy it because it's an okay game. It'll keep me entertained for like a couple hours, and it's I put on the Christmas list. And I do kind of buy it primarily for the multiplayer, because I know for at least a couple weeks I'll play it, and then I'll move on to something else, because that's part of my problem. So I don't like to stick with one game for very long. But there's no reason to go, well, if it's okay, you should accept it. No. I should be able to demand more from my games, because I get plenty of satisfaction from other stuff, and you guys know from my movie reviews, I'm not overly picky. I will find stuff entertaining that a lot of people complain about because, hey, I know, hey, relax, it's entertainment. But then again, games cost a lot more than movies do. And I have now gone on for 45 minutes on this. I guess I'll have to label this as really long rant on Call of Duty franchise. Just to give people fair warning. If you stuck with me for this whole thing, kudos to you. I hope you weren't just sitting there watching the video. I hope you put this on in like the background while you were reading something else online. But I give you credit if you watch this entire thing or listened to this entire podcast. Kudos. I know I'm gonna get some hate mail on this. People going, how dare you? Or who cares about the single player franchise? I do. I care about the single player aspect. I want more of the single player aspect. I could care less about the multiplayer stuff. For one thing, I have a ton of multiplayer games, so I don't need. If I want a single player game, why shouldn't I complain about the single player aspects? So anyone that complains, hey, it's for the multiplayer, no, not for me, and that's why I'm making the video. And there's other people that much rather have the single player stuff and can complain about the single player stuff. Here's my suggestion. At least pick somebody else new next time. Have us stop fighting the Russians every time. There's plenty of other threats out there. Why not do China? Battlefield did that. Oh, sorry. Now we're not scared shitless of China because they might not have sell products in their country. Grow a spine. Grow a goddamn spine. Or if you don't want to do China, do somebody more interesting. Do India. India has a huge military. You could do something with that. You could have India and Pakistan at war, and you have a special forces team that's trying to, stop it. There's a third party acting on it, or something like that, or have India and Bangladesh fight, and I don't know, something along those lines. You can have a threat in India. It's important. I don't know. I'm going on now, and it's been 45 minutes. I think it's time to wrap this up. So, again, kudos if you've listened to this entire thing. I congratulate you, sir or madam. And stay tuned for more videos. Please subscribe.